Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 281. This week the questions are taken from guides 350 and 351, that's on USS Jarvis DD 799 and USS Casablanca, well the Casablanca class of carriers, and the Wednesday videos on redesigning Bismarck and the K-class submarines with a guest question from a Friday video on paddles and propellers. Scott Mason asks, when the US was in the middle of their prohibition against alcohol from 1920 through to 1933, what would the Royal Navy do if they had to visit the US at the time? Did they have to hide all their rum, or were they allowed to keep it as long as they didn't leave their ships? Or did they just decide not to visit the US until it all ended? Well, since warships are considered to be travelling pieces of sovereign real estate of the country that they originate from, there was essentially zero chance of any prohibition enforcers in the US boarding a Royal Navy warship and confiscating the rum. I mean, even if that wasn't the case, I rather suspect the crew probably would have made sure that any such enforcers disappeared quietly into the sea. But since they were sovereign pieces and still are sovereign pieces of territory, that means that the laws of the country of origin of that warship apply on that warship. And since the UK did not have prohibition, there was no prohibition aboard a Royal Navy warship, even if it was tied up alongside a US pier. Of course, the instant you stepped off of that ship and onto US soil, you were now subject to US law, which meant that if you took some of your rum ration with you, then and were caught, then you could get in trouble. In fact, you probably get in trouble from both sides. You get in trouble from the US for having alcohol on you, and you get in trouble from your mates aboard the ship for having caused a bit of a ruckus. And the officers wouldn't be particularly happy with you either, especially since you're not supposed to take the rum off the ship anyway. Now, an interesting thing which I don't know the answer to would be if a sailor went ashore a bit plastered, what exactly would be the legality there? Now, normally, obviously, the rum ration isn't enough to get you plastered, but there's the tradition of sippers in, if it's your birthday, basically all your mates give you a sip of their ration, which if you're a little bit of a lightweight and or you have a particularly large mess that you're part of, you could get a little bit plastered doing that. Now, at that point, you would have consumed the alcohol in a place where it was legal for the alcohol to be and legal for you to consume, i.e. on board a Royal Navy warship. But if you somehow managed to slip past the officers guarding the gangways and then rolled into town, 3 sheets to the wind, and you were then picked up for being obviously drunk, well, I rather suspect that even in the Prohibition period, the rules against drunken disorderly conduct were probably still on the books. But, and this is where, I need the help of you guys who may have studied Prohibition or US law a little bit more, would that sailor have gotten in trouble for consuming the alcohol and clearly having, had the alcohol in the first place because he consumed it, as I said, in a place where it was legal for it to be, but the after effects were now being visited upon US soil? Now, I don't know, I suspect there probably was, but I don't know 100% if there was a culture in the northern US states of popping across the border to Canada to get plastered before heading back across the border, and what enforcement might have been done there. Did they cite you for consuming alcoholic substances even though it wasn't illegal where you had been, or did they just charge you with being drunk? Answers in the comments below. Vicky asks, under what circumstances could one realistically end up with a World War II-era battleship or fleet carrier's crew having to fight off an actual full-scale boarding action? I can think of 3 circumstances. So one would be forcible takeover in the manner of an internment. So you kind of actually see not to a full crew degree, but to a very small degree, this happening when exactly the circumstance comes up with the French fleet in 1940, when the British go aboard various ships in English ports, British ports generally, but most of the ports are in England, as it so happens. Sometimes the French crew resisted British troops coming aboard to take over their ships, and some people on both sides were killed in those boarding actions. So that would be one circumstance, and, potentially that was one of the nightmare scenarios that could have come about from the standoff in Alexandria, which was neatly avoided by Admiral Cunningham and Admiral Godefroy. Now, the second circumstance, which would probably be the only one you'd have at sea, would be if a battleship or fleet carrier was crippled, most likely in action, and then the fleet that owned that asset was forced to retreat fairly sharpish because they'd lost the battle and the enemy was advancing with considerable force, or potentially even maybe the battle wasn't necessarily lost, but the battle was moving to a new phase, which involved a separate enemy force, which the fleet didn't really have an answer for. At which point, a crippled vessel might end up being left behind. Now, obviously, normally you try and tow it, and if you can't tow it, then you would probably sink it yourself to deny that to the asset to the enemy, which is what happened in the picture with USS Hornet. This is Hornet crippled under tow, but obviously that didn't work out in the end. However, obviously in those circumstances you would evacuate the crew, but if you end up in a scenario where, let's say, looking at Hornet, for example, it's night, you think maybe Hornet can be saved, maybe she is in slightly better condition than she was historically, and so they're getting up to a decent speed. You've got the Japanese coming up behind at a fairly high speed, but then for whatever reason, something breaks, waves rise, just too much fatigue and tension on the line parts. Well, now you have a problem where the Japanese are closing in very, very quickly. You've got a partially or possibly even wholly manned asset, large capital asset. You probably don't have the time at that stage to turn around and evacuate everybody or sink it with external gunfire or torpedoes. Now, you might then, obviously the crew would probably try and scuttle the vessel, but in some circumstances, let's say, for example, maybe the Japanese are running ahead of even where the US think they are, maybe the line parts and a few minutes later somebody spots funnel glow on the horizon. So people just have to absolutely leg it, and in the confusion maybe the ship gets left behind, and then the enemy assets will overhaul that vessel and they can board it. And of course the crew will try and resist because it's a big asset. It's definitely worth giving a shot to capturing. Similarly, if you look at the second night battle of Guadalcanal, Washington and South Dakota versus Hiroshima, etc. If, for example, some of the torpedoes that were fired at USS Washington had found their mark, South Dakota is crippled and moving away, not really able to do much to help anybody. And if some of the torpedoes that were fired at Washington had knocked out her steering, perhaps, and her engines as well, there were Japanese ships in the vicinity that could have maneuvered in to try and board her, and there's nothing the US has in the vicinity that would be able to assist in taking off crew or scuttling Washington, at which point Washington, if she's lost all power so she can't fight either, may have faced a hostile boarding action. It would be a race against time between who can they scuttle the ship faster than someone can try and board it. Now, the final circumstance would be something like Operation Tango, where, let's say, Yamato somehow makes it to its target and runs aground. Well, then it's essentially just a fortification which can be attacked with infantry. So that would also be a boarding action. I've discussed in the past some of the various problems with boarding a modern armoured warship of any description, whether at sea or alongside on land. But one of the bigger ones at sea would be that unless the ship is completely and utterly crippled and dead in the water, which is probably easier to achieve with carriers than it is with battleships, the ship is capable of a degree of resistance, and obviously the lethality of that resistance gets higher and higher at closer range, which means that incoming ships would probably have to take out that means of resistance first, and the amount of damage you generally have to do, especially to a battleship, to get it to stop shooting at you is probably enough to render a boarding action pointless, because you've probably done fatal damage to that ship anyway. As I say, with an aircraft carrier, that might be slightly easier, because with an aircraft carrier, you could hose down the upper works with light and medium gunfire with using HE shells to, suppress 5-inch and 40mm and 20mm guns, etc., and then try boarding action if you were so inclined. Venom Geek Media asks, how usual was it to have battleships have their guns replaced by a greater number of lower caliber guns, and would it make a difference? In the Dreadnought period, it essentially didn't happen. In fact, replacing guns with different caliber guns generally didn't happen, period. The planned replacement of Gneisenau's 1111s with twin 15s is, near enough the one exception that proves that rule. And that's because usually, not all the time, but usually, guns were designed for the ships in such a manner that the guns would be big enough to punch through the armour that they were expecting to fight against, and maybe a generation past that. But no one had any real interest, usually, in going for uber-gigantic guns just because if you get a much, much bigger gun, it weighed more, which meant on a given displacement of hull you could fit less of them, which meant fewer shells going out, which meant less of a chance of a hit, etc., etc. And the chances of doing a little bit more damage per hit with, say, a 20-inch or 22-inch shell compared to the greater damage you do by hitting with 2 or 3, let's say 15 or 16-inch shells, one 15-inch hit, one 20-inch hit, the 20-inch shell's going to do a lot more damage, but if you, as I said, if you can hit with 2 or 3 15-inch shells, you'll do a lot more damage than that single 20-inch hit ever could, and you're more likely to do that because with the hull that can support, let's say, 6 20-inch guns, you could fit a lot more 15-inch. And what that meant, in turn, was that if you went much below a given caliber, then you were starting to enter territory of, can this gun actually penetrate my opposition's armour or likely near future armour? And once you skip forward, 3-4 generations of battleship design to a period where your ship is now old and you might be thinking, what can we do to update its firepower? Dropping down several gun levels in terms of caliber is definitely not going to be a good thing, because, of course, ship's protection is going to have been getting even better, at least in theory. Now, there are a few very, very minor exceptions to this. You could perhaps argue that refitting some of the older US standards, like, say, Pennsylvania, with 12-inch guns as designed for the Alaskas, might have been a good idea, because you could get more of them in there, and the 12-inch has similar penetration power to the old 14. But that's a very, very outside edge case where you're talking about the latest and greatest in gun technology from the early to mid-1940s compared to a 14-inch gun that's over 30 years old at that point. And you'd be investing a huge amount of money in a ship that is pretty much on its way to the breaker's yard in a few years anyway. Where battleships very often did have guns replaced by greater numbers of small caliber guns was during the design process, because a lot of design processes looked at maximal designs as well as minimal designs and usually settled for something in the middle. But that meant that, for every ship that was, say, designed with a 14-inch gun, there was probably a 16-inch variant somewhere in its design process that had been deselected, and so on and so forth for the different calibers of gun. But there are two cases where replacing guns with smaller caliber weapons did happen, and that was one in the late 19th century when some ships would have very large short barrel black powder weapons, which came from sort of the 1870s and early 1880s, Some of them had, in later life, those guns replaced by newer, longer barrel, smaller caliber, but still more powerful weapons, which obviously, if you wanted to, you could get more of them on there as well. And separate to that, you also had cases like HMS Delhi here and a bunch of other C-class cruisers. Delhi is a D-class. And in those cases, they're all armed with 6-inch guns originally, but they were rearmed as anti-aircraft cruisers with a variety of anti-aircraft weapons. The C-class were rearmed with 4-inch, and Delhi, as you can see here, was rearmed with 5-inch 38s. Shadow Wolf asks, the US Navy was able to build floating drydocks, some big enough to handle Iowa-class battleships, but why were there no floating slipways? It seems to me like a great way to increase the number of slipways you have without needing space on land, and they would be mobile, so these floating slipways could be moved to wherever they're needed. There's a few problems with the idea of floating slipways, i.e. floating construction slips for warships. First is balance, because remember, when a ship goes into a floating dry dock, usually it's at least relatively structurally intact. It might have a big hole in the side or something, but as an overall box girder, if you want to imagine it like that, it's mostly self-supporting, otherwise it would have collapsed into the sea already. Whereas if you're building a ship from scratch, then obviously the individual elements are not going to be self-supporting until a later stage in the construction. And given that floating dry docks do move around a bit, either with the tides if they're in a very sheltered area, or with wave action if they're in anything but the absolute most mill pond of waters, things can tip over and get misaligned, which is not good. But assuming you somehow manage to dodge all of those issues, you then have the problem that the loading is going to be changing regularly, which means you're going to have to be flooding and emptying, etc., all various tanks on that slipway to keep the whole thing on an even keel, which is going to be a massively involved process, which would be incredibly difficult even these days with computerized controls, let alone back in those days where people would have to be manually calculating and opening and closing and pumping, etc., on a near constant basis. And that's only going to get worse when it comes to launching the thing, because if you have built it true slipway style and you're going to chuck the thing off the end, that's going to be an absolutely colossal amount of changing balance and weight, which is probably going to flip the whole thing, to be perfectly honest, if you're not careful. So that's not necessarily a good idea. Using perhaps a floating graving dock, a floating dry dock where you just build the ship up and then just flood it and let the ship out, is a much, much better way of doing it than the conventional launch down slipway element. But then that leads into another issue, which is that floating dry docks, whilst they are very, very useful, very capable units, their amount of crane lifting capability is limited unless you stick something like a socking great crane ship up next to it. And when you're trying to lift in things like the machinery, for example, or some of the barbettes, etc., the machinery on the cranes on a floating dry dock almost certainly can't handle a lot of the larger loads that the really monstrous cranes you see on both land-based slipways and fitting out docks will have. And so whilst you might be able to build, let's say, a destroyer or something like that, or multiple destroyers in a floating dry dock or floating slipway, you're not going to be building much of anything that's bigger than that. And for a destroyer size or smaller vessel, there is plenty of space and plenty of small yards on land you can use. Because, of course, the other thing is you're going to have to bring all the materials for construction out to your floating slipway or floating building dock. Whereas on land, you can build railways right up to that location. Ultimately, I think the only way you're going to get a floating building yard of any kind of viability would be perhaps if you're trying to open a shipyard in a distant part of your dominions, and the rock is perhaps porous but otherwise relatively solid, at which point maybe just hacking a big hole in it and then sailing in a kind of single voyage, one and done deal floating dry dock, and then essentially concreting it in or rock filling it in place might work, but that would be a fairly expensive way of going about it. Niels Larson asks, why do navies build dedicated training warships in the steel and steam age, like Jeanne d'Arc? Why not use ships which are in service as warships? And there's a number of reasons. Firstly, in the treaty era, certainly by the time you get into the 1930s, you're looking at, if you use an active service warship, that, if it's being used in training, is taking a warship off of the front lines, but that warship is still going to count towards your overall limits on the number of ships you can have. So when you look at the London Naval Treaty, for example, whilst the restrictions on light cruisers are not as onerous as they are on heavy cruisers, where there's specific numbers specified, there is still an overall tonnage limit. So a training vessel that is specifically a training vessel doesn't fall into that, so you can get the training vessel and your frontline warships without having to take one offline. Another factor is that there are some differences between what is useful for a frontline warship and what is useful for a training ship. So that's why I suggested, if the Royal Navy had taken cues from the Argentinian cruiser-training vessel La Argentina, they would have had to make some modifications, because La Argentina, being configured not just for battle but also for training, and like Jeanne d'Arc, has large classrooms and the ability to accommodate considerably more people than the average cruiser of each of those vessels, given the sizes. And large open spaces, like you need for classrooms, and significant amounts of storage for crew, and in this case trainees, that is space that on a, if you like, proper frontline warship would be used for more guns, more armour, more torpedo launchers, etc., etc. So by having a dedicated training vessel, you can have more of those big open spaces, more messes, more accommodation, etc., etc., which makes it more efficient, because if you can then accommodate and train, let's say, 400 or 500 trainees, as well as having all the necessary spaces for a regular crew to operate the ship, because obviously you don't necessarily think the trainees are going to do a good job 24/7, then that is going to allow you to train a lot more people per voyage than cramming a few people here and there into a warship, where you might get, let's say, the size of a light cruiser, you might get another 150, 200 aboard. So it makes your training system better. And then, of course, on a training ship, you can have a lot more examples of things that you wouldn't necessarily have on a warship, because on a warship, uniformity is quite key. So again, using the example of a light cruiser, you might want 6-inch guns for your main battery, and then either 4.5, 4.7, or 5-inch guns for your anti-aircraft secondary battery. And then you would have, certainly in the interwar period, a caliber of your light or medium anti-aircraft guns, usually, maybe a few machine guns as well. And whether or not you have torpedo launchers at all depends on your national doctrine. Now, if your national doctrine says that cruisers shouldn't have torpedoes, well, you can't train anyone in the use of torpedoes on a ship that doesn't have them. And similarly, across the fleet, you might have, let's say, 40mm pom-pom, 40mm Bofor, 20mm Oerlikon, 1.1 inch, there's all sorts of things that could be present in various ships, but are not necessarily present on all. And on a training ship, you can have a very eclectic mix of armament: underwater torpedo tubes, above water torpedo tubes, 4.75 inch, 20mm, 25mm, 37mm, 40mm, all sorts of guns that you can then instruct lots of people on. And usually you want those in single mounts, because that's the easiest way to teach people how to use the gun. And if you have, half a dozen single mounts down one side of various descriptions, you can have half a dozen classes going on there. Whereas if you have 2 triple turrets, which would be better for a warship, well, you can probably at most teach 2 classes in there, and only on a full warship, probably only on 1 caliber, and on a training ship with 2 triples, maybe only on 2 calibers. So it's a lot more flexible, allows a lot wider a range of teaching tools than you would have on a full warship. Now, that's not to say that all training ships would do that, but when you look at their listed set of equipment, you'll find that most training ships do tend to have a slightly wider range of guns and torpedo launchers, etc. aboard than you'd find on any single given frontline warship. BK Jeanne asks, if you could swap out Bismarck with any other World War II era battleship design, and no non-battleship warship, for the sake of the Kriegsmarine, which ship would you choose? Now, I had to think quite hard about this, but excluding ships like Iowa and Yamato, which are kind of the next generation, and so it's a little bit unfair to everything else to include them. If you're looking at the interwar period ships, i.e. ships that are designed and major construction started in the 1930s, although, yes, I know technically Yamato almost falls into that, or pretty much does, but yeah, let's just leave Yamato aside, because the answer to if you can just magically replace battleships is always going to be either Yamato or Iowa, depending on the exact circumstance. So, leaving those aside, I eventually came to the conclusion that I would go with Richelieu, because when you look at that point, four main competitors, so North Carolina, King George V, Richelieu, and Littorio, for the uses that the Kriegsmarine is going to be putting Bismarck to, Littorio is too short range. Much as I like Littorio, and much as she does have a speed advantage over North Carolina and King George V, her range is not long enough. Now, I have made the point in the past, the Bismarcks were not designed for commerce raiding. Anyone who says Bismarck was designed as a commerce raiding battleship does not know what they're talking about. Bismarck was used as a commerce raiding battleship, but she was not designed as such. Nor was she designed specifically for North Sea actions against the Royal Navy. If you look at all the design documentation and discussion that surrounds Bismarck, Bismarck was designed, ironically enough, given my choices, primarily to fight the Marine Nationale, and the Marine Nationale is not known for operating in the North Sea, and nor is the Marine Nationale a merchant shipping line. Nonetheless, moving on from that. But yeah, we have to acknowledge that regardless of what she was designed for, Bismarck ends up being used in the Atlantic as a attempted commerce raider. And for that she needs range, and unfortunately the Littorios just do not meet that requirement. Now, that leaves you with three. You've got North Carolina, King George V, Richelieu. North Carolina does have the range, it is true, and she has some pretty nasty firepower in those 16-inch guns and her 5-inch 38 secondaries. However, again, with Bismarck primarily in wartime being utilised, or if you include Tirpitz, as a fleet-in-being commerce raider, North Carolina's armour scheme is ultimately an armour scheme that was designed to defeat 14-inch gunfire for the most part. It had some resistance against 16-inch or 15-inch gunfire, but primarily North Carolina was designed as a 14-inch armed ship with a 14-inch defeating armour scheme. And, that therefore, if you're going to be potentially raiding and fighting enemy battleships, you need something that's a little bit more heavily protected, in my opinion. Plus, vibration issues aside, North Carolina is just by a fraction the slowest of all the battleships under consideration, and if you need to get away from an angry enemy fleet, that's not a good thing. So that leaves you with King George V and Richelieu. Now, bearing in mind everything I just said, King George V is a little bit faster than North Carolina. Okay, she's not as fast as Littorio and Richelieu, but she's reasonably nifty. 14-inch guns, they're still perfectly capable, good fire control system, and with 10 guns it means you've got lots of shells, which means if you are doing commerce raiding, then great, you've got a good shell reserve. And she's very heavily protected, which matches up pretty well with what I was saying earlier about the need to withstand lots of incidental hits. Good torpedo defense system as well, so everything looks like it's coming up King George V's way, except for that speed. Again, while she is a little faster than North Carolina on paper, she's not fast enough to outrun flat out and outmaneuver a US fast battleship, or indeed another King George V, or if France is still in the war, a Richelieu, which can track her down. And then you look at Richelieu. She's got good armament. She's got a pretty decent armour scheme, decent armour layout. So she's not quite as heavily protected as King George V, but potentially maybe a bit better protected than a North Carolina. We'll leave aside Littoral because, as I said, we've dismissed her because of the range issues. The French guns, assuming that they are, fixed the way that Richelieu's guns were fixed historically, should work perfectly fine. And she's just got that speed. She is capable of getting up to a speed which will allow her to match pace with a lot of heavy cruisers that she might encounter and outrun most battleships that she'll encounter. And thus, for the uses that Bismarck was put to in World War II, I think actually the Richelieu class with a relatively decent range and their gun issues fixed would probably actually do them the best. Josh Thomas Moore asks, of the two ships lost in Forsaid, which was the bigger loss, Repulse or Prince of Wales? I know Prince of Wales was the newer and better protected vessel, but Repulse was faster and had bigger guns. It's got to be Prince of Wales. Even to be honest, if you put Renown and Prince of Wales up against each other, I'd still go Prince of Wales being the bigger loss. Because, yes, okay, Repulse does have 15-inch guns as opposed to Prince of Wales' 14-inch guns, but Prince of Wales has 4 extra guns compared to Repulse, so she has a much, much bigger, heavier broadside. Yes, Repulse is a bit faster than Prince of Wales, but Prince of Wales is not exactly a slouch in the speed department. She is, after all, a fast battleship. She's massively more protected, and that's really a key thing, because in a straight-up gunfight, Prince of Wales can, go toe-to-toe with anything in the Axis arsenal, whether that be a Bismarck, as she historically did, Littorio, etc., with the sole exception of Yamato. And in all those engagements, again, except for Yamato, Prince of Wales can count on having a good chance of winning, progressing up to a really good chance of winning. Whereas Repulse, well, with her armour, no matter how well she shoots, let's say if you look at case in point what was in the area at the time of their sinking, the Congo class. Now, would I rate Repulse against a Congo class? Sure. Both sides can hurt each other. It's pretty much down to who gets the first hit, who has the better gunnery. But Repulse really would have to just rely on a minor speed advantage to have any kind of significant advantage over a Congo. And if 2 Congos show up, there's very, very little chance of Repulse winning that engagement. Whereas Prince of Wales can easily master a single Congo class. And if 2 Congos show up, it's not brilliant because no 2v1 ever is. But Prince of Wales actually has a decent fighting chance of taking on 2 Congo class and surviving. Repulse, as I said, pretty much doesn't. And again, you look at things like the anti-aircraft suite. For all the faults of the early 5.25-inch guns, Prince of Wales has both a better anti-aircraft suite overall, and as we see in the latter part of the war with her sister ships, the capacity to have a significantly more upgraded anti-aircraft suite. She's got a better fire control system, she's got better radar, she's just got a lot more scope and capacity for improvement at a relatively small expense, whereas if you look at Repulse, the only way to really significantly improve on Repulse's capabilities is to do a Renown style refit, which will cost an absolute fortune. And then you look at Renown, and that's pretty much the max out that you could get. So yeah, whilst losing another battlecruiser was annoying for the Royal Navy, the loss of Prince of Wales was a much, much bigger strategic blow, because Prince of Wales could, if she'd survived, have been used to plug a weakness anywhere, and as I said, gone toe-to-toe with anything that wasn't a Yamato, whereas Repulse, wherever you put her, is still always going to be well, we could use her in this situation, but there are these vulnerabilities. Thomas Embleton asks, Drac, what could the Royal Navy get with a battleship that had the same tonnage as Bismarck? Well, I think this kind of really shows the core of the issues I have with Bismarck when it comes to efficiency, because if you look at Bismarck's displacement, which is just a fraction under 42,000 tons standard, and then Tirpitz's, which is just a fraction under 43,000 tons standard, and then you look at, what did the Royal Navy actually design that would fall into this approximate category? Well, it turns out there are a couple of ships that fall into that category. The Lion class. So you've got as options either the 1938 Lion class, the original design, which is just as fast, armed with 3 triple 16-inch guns, considerably better protected. What's not to like? And of course, it's lighter, so you could get a 1938 Lion class and a small to medium-sized destroyer for the same weight as a Bismarck. Or, if you kind of average out Bismarck and Tirpitz's displacement, then that actually very neatly aligns with the characteristics of the Lion 1942 design, which is heavier than Bismarck but a little bit lighter than Tirpitz, and still has the same ferocious armament. Admittedly, it's now dropped a little bit in speed, but is considerably more seaworthy because it will have a flared bow, which obviously the original Lion does not. It's got more of a Vanguard-style bow, and okay, they've rearranged the armour a little bit, but it's still arguably better protected than Bismarck. So just dropped a little bit of speed in exchange for better seaworthiness, better anti-aircraft capability, better torpedo defences, etc., etc. So this is pretty much the thing. Instead of Bismarck on the same displacement, the Royal Navy can get one of the 2 realistic Lion designs. Emanueline Ricove-Rani asks, had the M-class submarines of the Royal Navy, the ones armed with the pre-Dreadnought battleships cannons, been actively used, would they have been effective? In practice, no. I don't think they would have been effective at all. In theory, the final proposed use of them made sense. Torpedoes are expensive, they take up a lot of space, so if you can sneak up to within 1,000 yards, which is your ideal torpedo launch range, or potentially even closer, then instead of firing off a torpedo, which may malfunction, it may go off course, etc., etc., well, if you're there already, fire a 12-inch battleship gun at something. It probably won't survive any more than it would survive the torpedo hit. Theoretically, if you're up against an armoured target, you have a choice of using an AP shell, which is really not going to appreciate, and you can store a lot of AP shells. You can make the sub a bit more hydrodynamic because you don't have to worry so much about having large amounts of torpedoes in the bow. What's not to like? Except for pretty much everything about the poor old thing. So, yeah. In theory, if you could pull off a pitch-perfect attack pattern using the M-class subs, or at least the original one, this is M1, obviously, with its big 12-inch gun, yeah, it on paper could have been effective, but in practice, the chances of actually successfully getting an attack off are pretty slim. And the other thing is, once you do, even if you do get an incredibly destructive fatal hit on your target, unlike a torpedo-armed sub, which can then slip away, reload torpedoes, and come back to try again, or launch 1 or 2 torpedoes and keep others in the tubes in reserve for potential other targets or escort counterattack, with the M-class, if you want to reload that gun, you're going to have to surface for a little while the process is done, which renders you much, much, much more vulnerable. So, yeah, as a practical weapon, no, and I think that's pretty much why you see the other M-class refitted to test other concepts rather quickly. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, would it be possible to have a turtleback citadel and an all-or-nothing armour scheme at the same time? To my understanding, the turtleback citadel is defined by its use of sloped armour rather than running the length of the ship in multiple smaller and thinner plates. Yes, it is in theory possible to do, because the all-or-nothing armour scheme is obviously about concentrating near enough all your armour in a central citadel, which involves having 4.5 bulkheads, your side armour, and of course your deck armour. Now, whilst the vast majority of all-or-nothing armour schemes ever designed use a flat deck for your deck armour, as you can see there on the right with King George V, strictly speaking, there is nothing to say that you can't have your all-or-nothing citadel with a turtleback deck armour layout. The main limitations to that is going to be that the all-or-nothing scheme is designed around dealing with medium to long-range gunfire, and if you have a high turtleback, then you're going to have deck armour quite high in the ship, and those sloped sides are going to actually be considerably more vulnerable to plunging fire than a straight flat deck is. Conversely, you can have the turtleback much lower in the ship, adjoining the lower portion of the belt armour, which is what you have there on turpits on the left, and what historically was usually done with turtleback armour schemes. The disadvantage of that, of course, as you can see, is that your citadel space is considerably lower, and that might mean that you don't have citadel reserve buoyancy to keep your ship afloat, and various other restrictions about what you can put beneath the armour. But it is, a viable tactic, and you can try something halfway as well if you want. So yes, in theory, if you really wanted to, you could have a turtleback armour scheme for your deck armour, along with a general all-or-nothing citadel scheme. Vintage Car History asks, in the automotive world, I've seen some channels that make me think, what are you doing? No need to name names, but what do you think are things that other YouTubers do that smear real historians like yourself and other channels as well? There are a few things that I sometimes think when I look at certain channels that really do a disservice to those of us who are actually trying to do this properly. Now, much as I've said it repeatedly, and most of you have clocked onto which particular channel I'm referring to, behold, ladies and gentlemen, according to that particular channel, these are the Admiral Hipper-class battleships of the German Navy. And yeah, you're not going mad, those are actually Scharnhorst and Gneise. Now, don't tell their researchers that, if they have researchers, to be perfectly honest. So yeah, getting very major obvious things like that wrong. Now, I'm not going to say at all that getting a few minor details here and there wrong is overall bad. Everybody makes those kinds of mistakes. Everyone from your first year university student through to your grad student, through to someone doing a master's or a PhD. That's why you have to defend your PhD, and you might have corrections be made to it, even though you've spent a year or more studying that particular subject, just for your PhD, let alone your master's or your bachelor's. Even eminent historians, people who are right up there at the very top of the tower, they will sometimes make mistakes. And sometimes it's also not necessarily even a mistake. Sometimes there are multiple interpretations of the same event or the same circumstance or vessel, and those can be arguments that have been going on since those ships were in service or since that battle took place. And just because someone says, well, actually, I think this side of the argument is what I'm going to stick to, if someone else says, well, I completely disagree with you and clearly this side of the argument is actually the one you should come down on, that doesn't mean that either one is necessarily wrong. It just means they have different opinions. So I'm not saying that everyone has to stick to you must be 100% correct all the time in every single detail and always everyone must agree on something. That's not how it works. But there is a big gulf between that and this that you can see on screen. Then you've got ultra clickbait. Now, everyone likes to make a nice, neat-looking thumbnail, and you do have to try and grab people's attention, and you might use a witticism or a pun to do that, or an engaging picture, or something like that. Fine. But you can take it far, far too far when it comes to both the thumbnail and the title. So, the ubiquitous red arrow and or red circle, that is thoroughly stupid. It's well played out, and the chances are that most of the time when that's used, it's not actually pointing to anything even remotely useful in terms of justifying having that massive great thing on there. To each their own, but the "hi, I clearly added this in MS Paint" is a bit pathetic. Yes, well done. You've worked out people respond to the color red. That does not make you a creditable historian. That makes you able to understand basic color theory, which the average 5-year-old could tell you. And related to that, with the titles and everything, having stuff that's completely unrelated to or blatantly immediately falsifiable just to drag people in, you're not fooling anyone, and anyone who takes history seriously is going to just go, this is nonsense, including people who aren't on YouTube, but are working for museum ships, museums, etc. It's not that difficult. And again, without mentioning any names, you have titles like a modern one, Iranian vessels' unexpected attack against an insanely armoured US warship. Newsflash, moron. The US doesn't have any armoured warships anymore. They're all in museums. And even if you want to count splinter-proofing as armour or something like that, there's nothing in the US arsenal at the moment that could count as insanely armoured. The only thing that the US has, or that's in the US that could count as insanely armoured, would be the museum battleships, and again, they're not in service. Or you want to go with something more in keeping with this channel's time period. The most infamous sinking that shook the Allies to the core. Well, for one thing, there aren't really any major sinkings in World War II of single ships that shook the Allies to their core. I mean, maybe something like Force Z, but one, that was 2 ships, and 2, that was annoying. It didn't, leave the Royal Navy quaking in its boots. Even Pearl Harbor, nasty as it was, didn't shake the US Navy to its very core and have it questioning its meaning of existence. And then you look at the line of description text you get, and it's talking about HMAS Perth. Now, with all due respect to the Royal Australian Navy, the loss of the Perth during APA Command, well, 1, that was accompanied by the loss of USS Houston, and 2, that particular battle didn't really shake much of anything. Plus, of course, the thumbnail is a picture of the explosion of Barham, which is not a Leander-class cruiser, not in service with the Royal Australian Navy, did not sink in the Far Eastern Theatre, and also did not shake the Allies to their core. So, it's that kind of blatantly falsifiable dreck that gives everybody else a bad name. And then, separate to the actual history, you have the occasional channel's penchant for either getting massively committed to some modern political, social, activist cause, front, whatever you want to call it, i.e., now trying to tell everybody from a supposed position of authority what people should or shouldn't do, who they should or shouldn't back, who they should or shouldn't believe in, whatever. And it's like, no, if you're there to teach history, you're there to teach history. If people wanted to be told how to do X political or social activity, they'd go to someone who's an expert in that. Keep that stuff out of it. And relate to that, unnecessary arguments with other YouTubers. Occasionally there's a need to engage or disengage with another channel if something major comes up, but the kind of ongoing, months-long slagging back and forth, coming up every other video or something, and kind of when it gets personal long-term, that also is incredibly unprofessional. Patrick Donnelly asks, had USS Enterprise CV-6 not had her elevator go skywards, courtesy of Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu on 14th of May 1945, and thus she was with Task Force 38 when the Japanese surrendered, what are the chances she would be chosen over USS Missouri for the surrender ceremony? And if not, is there any other role or honour she may have? I think it comes down to 2 things. Firstly, whether or not the stories of Truman forcing the ceremony to happen aboard USS Missouri because of his connection to the ship and the state are true. And secondly, who's the flagship? Because, the 2 main arguments as to why Missouri is used, apart from the fact that Missouri has an awful lot of deck space, compared to some of the older ships, which makes her very suitable to have larger numbers of delegates aboard, is the fact that she's the flagship of the US fleet that's present in the area, and this whole connection with Truman. Now, the flagship, that can be changed, given that Halsey was the admiral in charge of US Third Fleet at the time. So I think given the history of Enterprise and given the fact that, Halsey does like his carriers, whilst he does spend a good chunk of the latter part of the war as a admiral aboard various battleships as flagship, I think if he'd been given the opportunity to have Enterprise there, he probably would have switched his flag to Enterprise if that was the key deciding factor. I mean, apart from anything, you can argue you like about how much deck space Missouri has compared to West Virginia, but I think in terms of open deck space, Enterprise is going to win that argument hands down. But if she is there and she's not chosen for the surrender ceremony, I don't think carrier onboard delivery aircraft had quite been invented yet. They did convert a bunch of Avengers for the purpose, but as far as I can recall, I think that was immediately post-war. Otherwise, I would have suggested flying everybody in onto Enterprise and have Enterprise docked up against Missouri, and then they transfer over to Missouri if that's where the surrender ceremony has to take place. That would be quite amusing. Or the other alternative would be perhaps to have Enterprise moored just to one side of Missouri, and then maybe have a bunch of seating erected on Enterprise, and Enterprise then becomes this giant viewing gallery which can literally look down on the surrender ceremony taking place. Brian Stevens asks, where do we see the first gunpowder weapons being used on ships as a regular thing? Was it maybe in China with some sort of rocket? If you want to be technical, it's probably in the 11th or 12th centuries over in China. Although they're not cannon, they are, well, as you can see on the ship on the left, more especially on the top there, but also on the one on the right, they have catapults aboard which throw projectiles at the enemy ships, and there are some accounts that in this time period the Chinese were throwing essentially gunpowder bombs from their catapults, so that would be a gunpowder weapon, although my Chinese history is nowhere near good enough to say whether or not that was a kind of one-off thing for that campaign or whether that continued in use on various Chinese warships afterwards. When you then see gunpowder weapons in the form of cannon showing up aboard ships as a regular and continuous thing rather than a one-off, about the earliest I could find would be the kind of the mid to late 14th century. That's when, at least in terms of fixed forward firing cannon attached to the bows of ships, that's when it starts to seem relatively commonplace, at least in certain theatres. And then it spreads from there, both obviously with the big forward-mounted guns and then later broadside-mounted guns as you go through the 15th and into the 16th centuries. Greb asks, during the World War I era, let's say 1900 to 1920, taking into account the different requirements of each navy, what, in your opinion, is the best cruiser design for each major navy, not including armoured cruisers, and what is the best overall cruiser of that era, regardless of navy? I actually think the answer is pretty much the same for both questions, both in the best cruiser design for the roles that each major navy needs them to fulfill and overall. And that would be the Town-class cruisers of the Royal Navy of World War I, as opposed to the Town-class cruisers of the Royal Navy of the 1930s. And specifically, within that, I would actually zoom in on the Birkenhead subclass, although some of the preceding subclasses would also probably fit. Now, the reason I say that is because I'm excluding ships that are commissioned towards the end of World War I, like some of the C-class, the Caledons and onwards, for example, because realistically they come in a little bit too late to be useful for the majority of World War I, and we're looking at the World War I era. And if you go far back to 1900, I mean, cruiser technology in 1900 versus cruiser technology in the 1910s is almost two entirely different things. But when you look at the Town class, they are light armoured cruisers in the way that the C class are. They have a 2-inch belt. So some of the notable town class that would fall into the other subclasses I'd class as pretty good would be things like, HMAS Sydney, the first one from World War One, Glasgow, or from Battle of Coronel and Falkland Islands, etc. And the reason for all of this is that not only have they got side armour, which, okay, it's only 2 inches thick, but against the vast majority of cruisers, being that we're excluding armoured cruisers, gives you a pretty good defensive capability, far in excess of just having a protected cruiser deck, and they still have a protected cruiser deck as well. They're also quite quick at around 25 knots, which is, useful for hunting down smaller and slower vessels. At around 5,000 tons or just over, they're not monstrously large, so you can build them in reasonably large numbers. They're around relatively early, certainly compared to something like the C-class. And outside of the first subclass, they're all armed with, the majority, 6-inch guns, so they hit a lot harder than a lot of smaller cruisers that are armed with, 4.1 inch or something like that, or a mixture of heavier guns and 4-inch or thereabouts. And the reason I specifically looked at the Birkenhead subclass, which were actually originally supposed to be built for a foreign navy and then taken into service in World War One by the Royal Navy, is that they don't actually use the 6-inch, they use the 5.5 inch, which Hood would also later use, which has almost as much firepower, is still vastly more powerful than a 4 or 4.1 inch gun, but because it has a slightly lighter shell than the 6-inch, actually has a considerably better rate of fire. So for the British, who need something they can manufacture in large numbers that can hit fairly hard and has a decent amount of protection against other period cruisers, it works perfectly fine. For the Germans, who need something survivable to take on the majority of smaller cruisers, they need something fast to outrun large fleets of cruisers, and they need something they can mass produce. It works perfectly fine. It works for pretty much for every major navy. It's a really, really good solid design, and it's one that you can start building in numbers before World War One breaks out. As I said, to sort of have a similar kind of capability, you then have to look for the Caledon subclass of the C-class cruisers, and they're not around until after Jutland. The Rogue Chief asks, rewatching the Nelson series, it seems that much of Nelson's reputation is built upon the Battle of Trafalgar. But in his own lifetime, his reputation seems to be one of scandal, insubordination, and brash recklessness whilst happening to win a couple of battles. How did someone like that get command of Britain's most important fleet at Trafalgar in the first place, instead of someone perhaps a little bit more politic? In a similar token, how did Villeneuve get command of the French fleet given his own record, and then stay in command without getting fired by Napoleon for as long as he did? Well, for Villeneuve, Napoleon didn't actually want him in command originally. Originally, that was going to go to Admiral Latouche-Treville, who was, frankly, a far, far better officer. But poor old Latouche-Treville died, and Villeneuve happened to be a senior-ish admiral who happened to be around. And thus far, despite, having kind of, sort of, failed a bit at the Battle of the Nile, hadn't been directly responsible for any major disasters. So he got command. And, as I've said before, Villeneuve wasn't a bad officer when someone else was giving him the directions. So, his record wasn't terrible. It turned out he was pretty poor as a command officer, but that's a separate matter entirely. And then, essentially, once he deploys from Toulon, he's on one very long extended campaign, and Napoleon, knows that the one absolute worst thing you can do is replace a commander midway through a campaign. That's a really good way to tank morale and completely ruin everything. Unless, of course, they're doing something completely insubordinate and treasonous. And secondly, given the complications of the speed of communication in the Age of Sail, even if you wanted to replace him, how on earth are you going to do that? Because any information you have on where he is going to be hopelessly out of date by the time you've decided on somebody else to take command and then sent them out there in presumably a single small vessel, which may be liable to capture. You'll note that essentially very soon after Villeneuve stops moving, and therefore it's possible to work out where on earth he is for, with more predictability than a couple of days' time, when he's locked up in Cadiz, Napoleon does actually move to replace him, but Villeneuve sails before that replacement can arrive. When it comes to Nelson, Nelson has a lot of, I wouldn't necessarily say downsides, but he has a lot of issues hanging over him for various reasons. His, social scandal with Emma Hamilton, the various questionable attempts by him to be a land-based general in Italy, etc., etc. But when it came to command at sea, yes, he was reckless, but, recklessness and courage and boldness and decisiveness are very often synonymous with each other, and which one exactly gets picked usually depends on hindsight and looking at the aftermath. And usually, when it came to seaborne stuff, Nelson's recklessness, if you want to call it that, tended to get him results, and nothing rewards success like success. And he kept winning, as a captain aboard the ironically named HMS Captain. He manages to turn the Battle of Cape St. Vincent from what would have been a minor victory to a fairly important one. And then, of course, you've got the Nile and Copenhagen. And the thing is, he's got a relatively decent tactical head on him. He knows how to fight a sea battle. And so you have this combination of an officer who clearly knows how to fight a sea battle, is very aggressive and seeks the annihilation of the enemy, seems to have a fairly good track record of actually pulling it off, and due to a combination of all of those factors, as well as generally seeming to be a decent-ish chap to his men, he has both the loyalty of a good chunk of the Navy officers and men, and, when his latest scandal isn't being blown up in the newspapers, the adoration of much of the public. Plus the, complication of the fact that the longer you seem to leave him on land, the worse and worse he seems to make his social situation. So when you add all that together, it suddenly becomes a very good idea to point Nelson at the enemy and, light the blue touch paper and sit back and watch the fireworks, because that's what he's really good at. You have to, there are a lot of other good admirals out there in the Royal Navy, but in terms of being able to just attack the enemy like a rabid dog and shred them, there's very, very few who can match Nelson for that. Cochrane would be one of them, but in 1805, Cochrane is way, way, way down the pecking order compared to Nelson, who's been a flag officer for quite a while. So when you're faced with a potential threat like the combined Franco-Spanish fleet, which the Royal Navy and Britain as a whole knew was aiming at them, as in an invasion, it makes sense. It's like, take this guy who's really good at destroying French and Spanish ships and put him in charge of a fleet and tell him, destroy those French and Spanish ships. And as it turns out, he's really, really good at destroying French and Spanish ships, hence the Battle of Trafalgar. And, you kind of get the fact that, as many people have said, and personally I tend to agree with, in a lot of ways, although he probably would have disagreed at the time, Nelson in some ways got quite lucky to die at Trafalgar, because he got to die at the moment of triumph, and it's relatively difficult to tarnish that. Whereas, given the lack of major naval battles post-Trafalgar, if he'd won Trafalgar and survived, chances are one of two things would have happened. Either he would have ended up literally rotting away, keeping an eye on them all, the way poor old Admiral Collingwood eventually ended up doing, or he would have been brought back to a hero's welcome and then promptly trashed his reputation by a series of ongoing social faux pas. Oh, and before anyone chimes in the comments about the whole, Nelson supported slavery thing, no, he didn't. First, factor non-verbal actions, not words. His actions throughout his life seem to suggest that he was actually against the idea of slavery as a whole. And secondly, as Professor Lambert and a number of others have pointed out in a number of studies, there's an exceptionally good chance, obviously we can't say absolutely 100% certainty, but as near as we possibly can in these kind of things, that the supposed letters that were circulated 3 or 4 years after he died, where he seems to show support for the slave trade, are almost certainly faked. That's a completely separate question. I might go into that in another dry dock if people ask. But But, Professor Lambert and and the others who worked with him have done a huge amount of work to prove that. It's just that, well, that's not convenient for the media to walk back on things once they've tried to trash someone like that these days. And finally for this week, Matt Kidd asks, Bligh was the only officer on board the Bounty, and the ship didn't have any Marines on board. Was this unusual for such an extended voyage, and did either contribute to the mutiny? The lack of Marines wasn't necessarily unusual given the Bounty's size, rating, and overall crew complement. She was, as a ship, just generally considered too small to rate anything more than just Bligh. Including a Marine contingent on a ship of this size usually wasn't done, in part because any meaningful contingent of Marines would have then made up a significant portion of the ship's crew, and of course, as Marines, they're not going to be able to help out 24/7 with things like sailing the ship. So whilst the exact breakdown of the ship's officer and men complement wasn't necessarily unusual for a ship of that size, perhaps sending a ship of that size on such an extended and particular mission, that was a little bit out of the ordinary, but not unheard of. But did either of them contribute to the mutiny? Possibly, but only tangentially. So in the case of having another officer on board, that might have provided a slightly different perspective that might have recognised issues with the ship that Bligh didn't recognise, and would be, by being a commissioned officer, would have the social positioning whereby he could actually remonstrate with Bligh over these things without it causing a major upset. And if worse comes to worst, yes, if you had a contingent of Marines that, well, that could have potentially broken the mutiny. It wouldn't have stopped the mutiny from happening in the first place. But then again, it comes down to this whole thing of, if you've got 20 or 30 guys on a ship this size who really want to get rid of someone, would having 2 or 3 armed men as well as Bligh actually stop it? Because there are cases of ships with small Marine contingents where mutinies took place, and if the mutiny is large enough, you can just overwhelm the Marines, because still talking single-shot muskets and so forth. So possible minor contributory factors, but I wouldn't necessarily put a huge amount of stock in them absolutely being able to stop the mutiny if you changed those parameters. And that's it for this video. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. Just a quick heads up, for those of you who've reached this far in the dry dock, I will be heading over to the States in mid-February, but I know that's a bit short notice, but to be honest, my own plans are still a little bit up in the air, so I will try and keep people informed as best I can, but this is a very, very moving target, as there are a couple of key events that I want to try and get to, but exactly when those are happening is still up in the air, so we shall see.